History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. The rise and fall of great powers is rarely the result of a single catastrophic event. Rather, it is the culmination of years of strategic missteps, internal decay, and the calculated moves of adversaries who understand the weaknesses of an empire better than it understands itself. The United States, once the undisputed leader of the free world, has spent the past decade drifting toward the abyss, pulled by a force more insidious than any external enemy, its own failure to recognize the war being waged against it. This is not the story of a foreign conquest in the traditional sense. There were no armies marching across American soil, no nuclear strikes that turned cities to ash. Instead, the collapse came in stages, subtle at first, then undeniable, then irreversible. It began as a psychological war, a battle for perception and legitimacy. It accelerated as American leaders, caught in their own ideological struggles, made choices that weakened their alliances and emboldened their adversaries. It ended in a single day, when the last lights of the Republic flickered out and the world moved on without it. Recent geopolitical events suggest a coordinated effort to isolate, destabilize, and ultimately cripple the United States through psychological, diplomatic, economic, and cyber warfare. The key players, authoritarian regimes led by Russia and China, appear to be engineering a shift in US behavior that will turn its allies away, weaken its institutions, and leave it vulnerable to a decisive, deniable strike. The fall of the United States is not inevitable, but it is predictable. From the moment its enemies began reframing it as the villain, to the moment its own leaders embraced isolation and self-destruction, the path was set. What follows is one timeline of its undoing, a step-by-step breakdown of how the most powerful nation in history has been systematically weakened and isolated, and could ultimately be dismantled, without a single foreign power ever having to fire a shot. The first phase was a systematic effort to erode the United States' moral authority and global credibility, ensuring that when the time came for its collapse, the world would be unwilling or even pleased to let it fall. Russia's strategy was not just to weaken US influence, but to reframe America as an unreliable, self-interested actor on the world stage. By provoking a prolonged Western response to the Ukraine war, exploiting ideological divisions over the Israel-Gaza conflict, and amplifying domestic polarization through disinformation, this phase successfully divided the US internally while alienating its closest allies. The Russian intelligence objective in this phase was to systematically erode the U.S. moral authority and diplomatic credibility, forcing a realignment of global alliances while making the American public and leadership question their own values. The goal was not simply to weaken US influence, but to reframe the United States as an unreliable, hypocritical, and self-interested actor on the world stage. This was necessary for later steps, which would isolate the US and leave it vulnerable to a strategic infrastructure attack. This phase began with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, which was not just a territorial war, but a calculated global psychological operation intended to accelerate the decline of US leadership. Russia knew that an open, aggressive war in Europe would force the West into a major geopolitical response. The invasion was deliberately reckless, with Russian forces committing widespread war crimes, executing civilians, and bombing cities in ways that would guarantee Western outrage and intervention. Russia's intent was to trigger a massive, prolonged Western reaction that would gradually drain US resources, divide its political landscape, and alienate its allies through sheer exhaustion. Moscow understood that the United States and its European allies would not allow Ukraine to collapse, but also that they lacked the strategic patience for a drawn-out conflict. From the moment of the invasion, Russian intelligence began preparing the conditions for the United States to reverse its own role, from leading a coalition against aggression to demanding its own allies' surrender. By escalating its brutality in Ukraine, Russia ensured that the United States would commit to full-scale military and economic support for Kyiv. This was necessary for the next phase, in which Russian intelligence would slowly erode US public support for that intervention and make it politically untenable. Russian agents cultivated relationships with isolationist factions within US politics and media, reinforcing a narrative of endless war, financial drain, and strategic futility. At the same time, Russian diplomacy sought to play on European fears of economic collapse, energy shortages, and an unwinnable conflict, with the ultimate goal of weakening the coalition before the US lost patience. By late 2023, Russian intelligence had successfully nurtured deep fractures within the US political system regarding continued support for Ukraine. While initially framed as a clear-cut struggle between democracy and autocracy, the war increasingly became a point of contention within the US, with each side accusing the other of strategic miscalculation or moral failure. This internal polarization was critical for the next step, introducing deeper moral relativism into all US foreign policy debates. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched an unprecedented attack on Israel, targeting civilians in a way that guaranteed a massive, disproportionate Israeli military response. The timing was not incidental. The attack occurred on Vladimir Putin's birthday, a symbolic gesture confirming that this was part of a larger Russian intelligence operation. Russia had long cultivated relationships with Hamas through Iranian proxies, and it is now clear that Moscow played a direct role in enabling the attack. The purpose was to force the United States into an unsolvable moral dilemma. By ensuring a massive Israeli retaliation, Russia created the conditions for an unresolvable global conflict over whether the US was supporting the right side. The success of this strategy was immediate. The US public, already fatigued from the war in Ukraine, fractured along ideological lines. The left condemned Israel's response, the right doubled down on unwavering support, and the center became increasingly disoriented by the lack of clear moral footing. Russian intelligence amplified these divisions through targeted disinformation campaigns, ensuring that no consensus could form. At the same time, Russia began reframing its own war in Ukraine using the moral uncertainty created by the Hamas-Israel war. The Kremlin's narrative shifted from outright denial of aggression to moral whataboutism. If Israel can bomb civilian populations and claim self-defense, why can't we? The strategic intent was to further blur the distinction between democracy and autocracy, aggression and self-defense, right and wrong. By early 2024, Russia had successfully reframed the global perception of the US as a reckless, self-interested power, one that fueled wars rather than prevented them. The US was no longer the unquestioned leader of the free world, but rather a power whose alliances and motives were constantly questioned. With American moral authority weakened, the next step was to push the United States into actively alienating its own allies through policy decisions that reinforced Russian objectives. This stage required a combination of direct influence operations and the careful manipulation of existing isolationist sentiments within US leadership. Russian intelligence played both sides, infiltrating movements that called for complete disengagement from global conflicts while also encouraging hardline positions that would further isolate the United States internationally. This phase accelerated after the 2024 US elections. Russian influence networks worked to convince the new administration that NATO, Ukraine, and foreign alliances were not assets, but liabilities. At the same time, Russian diplomacy privately reassured European and Asian leaders that the US was unreliable, pushing them toward alternative security and trade partnerships. By the end of this phase, Russia had successfully reframed the US from a leader of democracy to an isolated power whose alliances were crumbling and whose credibility was in doubt. The key strategic achievements were: the US public no longer agreed on who the good guys were in global conflicts. The US had alienated its closest allies by embracing an unpredictable and self-interested foreign policy. The US had de-escalated its cyber posture against Russia, signaling weakness and reducing deterrence. The US leadership had begun to consider strategic engagement with Russia, a reversal of decades of policy. The conditions were now set for the next phase to encourage the collapse of US infrastructure and its remaining diplomatic alliances. The second phase was designed to ensure that, when the final attack came, the United States would stand alone. Russian and Chinese intelligence worked to manipulate US policy decisions, driving the country toward economic and military isolation. By dismantling USAID, cutting off military aid to Ukraine, and waging economic war on its allies, the US weakened its own global standing, convincing once loyal partners to seek alternatives. These moves, justified under the guise of national interest, instead created the conditions for strategic vulnerability. By early 2025, the stage had been set for the most dangerous and volatile period in modern US history. The long process of moral erosion was complete. America's role as a trusted leader in global affairs had been methodically undermined. Now, in a matter of weeks, a series of deliberate, coordinated actions would push the country into complete international isolation, ensuring that when the final attack came, there would be no one left to stand with it. At the center of this unraveling was the destruction of America's diplomatic, economic, and military commitments abroad. Each decision, the dismantling of USAID, the imposition of trade tariffs, and the severing of military aid to Ukraine, was framed as a domestic necessity, but in reality, these moves served a larger geopolitical strategy to isolate the United States from its allies and leave it strategically vulnerable. This phase unfolded with alarming speed. The first and most immediate blow came in early February 2025, when the administration announced the complete dismantling of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. The decision was swift and brutal. Over 90% of aid contracts were terminated overnight. Global programs were shut down, and thousands of career officials were told to clear their desks within days. The official justification was cost-cutting and government efficiency, but the real impact was far greater. USAID had been one of the last remaining pillars of US soft power. It provided food, healthcare, and disaster relief to millions across the world, ensuring that even in times of war and crisis, the United States remained a force for stability. Its destruction sent an unmistakable message. The US was no longer a global partner. It was retreating. The consequences were immediate. Across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, humanitarian programs ground to a halt. In Ukraine, emergency aid shipments were frozen. In war-torn Gaza, critical medical relief was abandoned, exacerbating an already dire crisis. Protests erupted from both inside and outside the US government. Over 700 diplomats signed a dissent cable warning that the move would irreparably damage US influence abroad. Their warnings were ignored. Russia and China wasted no time filling the void. Within days of the USAID collapse, Beijing announced a $10 billion global aid expansion program, offering support to countries that had previously relied on American assistance. Russia followed, increasing its humanitarian operations in occupied Ukraine and Syria, portraying itself as the new global stabilizer. This was the first major turning point. With US humanitarian influence dismantled, the world had been primed to look elsewhere for leadership. As the fallout from USAID's collapse spread, the administration turned to another drastic move, a wave of protectionist trade measures that sent shockwaves through the global economy. In early March 2025, the White House announced sweeping tariffs on key allies, including Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. The most severe action came in North America, where the US imposed a 25% tariff on all imports from Canada and Mexico. These were two of America's largest trading partners, bound together by decades of economic agreements under NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA. The tariffs triggered an immediate response. Canada and Mexico retaliated in kind, imposing their own restrictions on US exports. The damage was not just economic, it was diplomatic. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gave an emergency address, denouncing the US as an unreliable partner. In Mexico City, officials began exploring deeper trade ties with China, seeking to reduce dependence on the US economy. Europe was next. France and Germany, already uneasy over America's shifting foreign policy, saw the new tariffs as confirmation that the US could no longer be trusted. Talks of an independent European security and trade alliance, free from US influence, accelerated. Markets reacted violently. By mid-March, major US stock indices were in freefall, with global financial analysts warning of an economic realignment that would see power shift away from the United States and toward China. In less than a month, the administration had burned through decades of economic goodwill. The world had been forced to acknowledge a new reality. The United States was no longer an indispensable economic leader. The final and most devastating rupture came in mid-March 2025. The United States began making a series of key policy moves that confirmed its isolationist shift. The most consequential decision was the abrupt suspension of all military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine on March 5, 2025. A move that not only weakened Ukraine's defenses, but also signaled to European allies that the US was no longer a dependable partner. Simultaneously, the administration ordered US Cyber Command to stand down from offensive operations against Russia, further reducing American deterrence capabilities. These choices were not made independently, they were the culmination of a long-term Russian strategy to guide the United States into self-sabotaging its alliances and deterrence posture. For 3 years, Ukraine had fought for its survival, relying on a fragile but vital lifeline of US and NATO support to hold back Russian advances. But now, the administration had decided that the war was no longer in America's interest. Aid shipments were halted. Critical satellite intelligence, which had given Ukrainian forces real-time battlefield awareness, was cut off. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held an emergency press conference, warning that the decision would embolden Russia to escalate its military operations. European leaders were blindsided. NATO, still heavily dependent on US support, was thrown into crisis. In Moscow, the reaction was celebratory. Russian state media portrayed the move as proof that the United States was weak and unreliable. Within days, Russian forces intensified their offensives in eastern Ukraine, sensing that Kiev had been left exposed. The backlash in Europe was unlike anything seen before. France and Germany openly questioned US leadership, with Macron declaring that Europe must prepare for a future without American security guarantees. NATO officials scrambled to devise an alternative strategy, exploring ways to arm Ukraine without Washington's support. Behind closed doors, European diplomats began reaching out to Beijing, exploring economic and political alternatives. A quiet but decisive shift was taking place. For the first time since World War II, major US allies were actively seeking to distance themselves from American influence. As March 2025 progressed, the process of isolation was complete. In just 2 months, the United States had undergone the most dramatic collapse in international standing in its history. From global humanitarian leader to economic powerhouse to military superpower, each pillar of its influence had been systematically dismantled. First, USAID was destroyed, erasing decades of American humanitarian influence and allowing China and Russia to take its place. Then, the administration waged economic war on its own allies, pushing Europe, Canada, and Mexico toward alternative trade agreements that reduced US economic dominance. Finally, Ukraine was abandoned, shattering what remained of US credibility as a security partner. For Russia, this was the moment it had been waiting for. The US was now isolated, leaderless, and vulnerable. When the final strike came, a catastrophic attack on the nation's infrastructure, there would be no allies left to come to its aid. The third and final phase was the execution of a long-prepared cyber and infrastructure attack that would permanently cripple the United States. Coordinated strikes on the power grid, nuclear plants, and military communication systems plunged the nation into chaos, rendering the government unable to function. March 22, 2025. The collapse began in darkness. At first, it was nothing more than a series of routine failures. A power fluctuation here, a communication delay there. The technicians who noticed the early warnings had no reason to panic. They had seen outages before. They had seen cyber attacks before. But this was different. At 3:22 a.m. Eastern Time, the first substation exploded outside Philadelphia. Fire crews responded, but the transformers were still humming with energy, overloaded beyond safe levels. Even as they attempted to contain the flames, other stations began failing in sequence, as if the grid itself was unraveling. At the same time, across the country, power plant operators lost control of their own systems. At Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station in Arizona, the night shift was wrapping up, groggy technicians reviewing checklists as they prepared for shift change at 6 a.m. That's when the coolant pumps shut down. At Diablo Canyon in California, a technician tapped at a control panel that had suddenly stopped responding. Then a second monitor went dark. Then a third. By the time he reached for the emergency shutdown lever, the core temperature had already begun to climb. Operators at Indian Point in New York, Braidwood in Illinois, and Vogtle in Georgia saw the same error messages flash across their screens. But the warnings weren't real. The system itself had been compromised. For years, cyber experts had warned about the risk of foreign actors embedding themselves in nuclear infrastructure. They had spoken at hearings, they had published reports, they had begged the government to take action. But CISA had been dismantled in February. Cybercom had been ordered to stand down against Russian and Chinese cyber threats. The FBI's counterintelligence unit had been gutted, the warnings had been ignored, and now everything was unraveling at once. Inside the Limerick generating station in Pennsylvania, the morning shift stepped in, coffee cups in hand, completely unaware that the night crew had lost control of the plant. On the main control board, flashing error codes indicated a full systems failure. The on-duty supervisor, a veteran nuclear engineer with 30 years of experience, reached for the phone to call the Department of Energy. The line was dead. He tried the emergency override, Nothing responded. Then the alarms began, not just at Limerick, at every nuclear plant in the country. At Diablo Canyon, California, an operator slammed his fist into the panel, trying to force an emergency shutdown, but the control rods never dropped. Outside, as workers fled the plant in panic, a deep, thunderous explosion ripped through the containment building. The cloud of radioactive steam rose over the California coastline. There was no stopping it now. At Braidwood in Illinois, a backup generator finally roared to life, too late to prevent the inevitable. The core began to crack. By the time the meltdown reached full breach, Chicago had less than 6 hours before the fallout would begin drifting toward the city. At Indian Point, New York, the emergency shutdown had worked for exactly 5 minutes. Then, a second-stage cyber attack corrupted the coolant backup system. The remaining operators, desperate to contain the crisis, issued a final distress call before the lines cut out completely. By 8:30 a.m., 3 nuclear plants were in full-scale meltdown. By 9 a.m., radioactive plumes were visible from Manhattan. When the nuclear plants failed, they took the last remnants of the grid with them. From New York to Florida, from Illinois to Louisiana, the Eastern Interconnection, the largest electrical grid in the world, collapsed entirely. Transformers blew out in spectacular bursts of light. City after city plunged into darkness. In Washington, D.C., the White House lost power. The president and his cabinet were rushed to emergency bunkers as aides scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation. The lines to the Department of Energy were dead. The NSA was silent. The Pentagon was offline. Inside the West Wing, an advisor stared at the blank monitors and whispered, "Oh my God, we just lost the country." At exactly 12 p.m. Eastern Time, Chinese state media interrupted all broadcasts with a live emergency report. The video feed was crisp, almost cinematic. High-resolution satellite footage of a firefight raging at a U.S. nuclear missile silo site. It was not a simulation. It was not an old clip. It was happening right now. The footage showed armed combatants dressed in mismatched U.S. military gear, exchanging gunfire with what appeared to be active-duty personnel. Smoke and debris filled the frame as explosions erupted around the hardened silos. A helicopter was seen strafing ground forces, but its tail was hit, sending it spiraling downward into a fireball. The camera zoomed in, and the voice of the Chinese news anchor, eerily calm, measured, almost sympathetic, explained to the world what they were watching. It appears that rogue elements within the American military are attempting to seize control of nuclear weapons. This is not the first such incident today. We are now receiving reports that U.S. nuclear launch facilities across the country have been compromised by insurrectionist factions. The United States is no longer in control of its own arsenal. The screen cut to a wide-angle view of missile silos in Montana, their security perimeters ablaze with tracer fire. Then another, this time from North Dakota, where tactical vehicles were seen ramming into fenced enclosures, breaking through to classified areas. Finally, the most damning footage yet. Satellite imaging over Kings Bay, Georgia, home of the U.S. Navy's Atlantic ballistic missile submarine fleet. There, black smoke rose over the base, and in the distance, a missile submarine was seen departing port, without authorization. The Chinese anchor's voice dropped to an almost mournful tone. The world cannot afford to wait. The time has come for responsible nations to act. The Chinese satellite footage spread globally within minutes. There was no counter-broadcast from Washington. The White House was offline. The Pentagon was silent. The federal government no longer had the ability to respond in real time, and the people had no way to hear the message. At 12:15 p.m., Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping appeared side by side at a hastily convened press conference in Moscow. Putin spoke first, his expression grave. "We have watched, in horror, as the American people have suffered through the worst crisis in their history. We have hoped, prayed, for stabilization, but it has not come. Instead, we now see rogue military units engaging in armed conflict over nuclear weapons. The chain of command in Washington has collapsed. We cannot allow these weapons to fall into extremist hands. Xi took over. It is with great sadness that we must acknowledge the truth. The United States, as we have known it, no longer exists." A long pause, then the final statement. "To protect the world from nuclear catastrophe, the international community must act now." At 12:30 p.m., China announced that it would be deploying military forces to stabilize the situation, beginning with U.S. bases in the Pacific. At 1 p.m., Chinese special operations teams landed at U.S. Naval Base Guam. There was no resistance. The base had lost all command structure. At 2:15 p.m., Russian paratroopers landed outside Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska. The Pentagon had no ability to issue counter-orders. At 3 p.m., a joint fleet of Chinese and Russian naval forces began advancing toward the west coast, broadcasting offers of humanitarian aid. At 4 p.m., Russia and China formally declared the U.S. federal government defunct, placing the United States under international martial law. And still, there was no response from Washington, because Washington no longer functioned. The bunker felt smaller than it had an hour ago. The air was heavy with diesel fumes and sweat, with the heat of too many bodies packed into too little space. The only sound was the steady hum of the generators, filling the silence left behind by the collapse of the world outside. The president stood at the center of it, hunched over the last working console, refusing to accept what he was seeing. The screens in front of him told an impossible story. Washington, D.C. was gone. The White House dark. The Pentagon silent. The Eastern power grid had collapsed. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, entire cities swallowed by the blackout. Russian forces had landed in Alaska. The Chinese fleet was advancing on California, moving under the banner of a humanitarian response. But none of it mattered, not yet. There were still options. "We need to force an emergency UN resolution," the president said, his voice hoarse but steady. "A multinational coalition." No one responded. The director of national intelligence didn't even lift her head from her hands. The Secretary of Defense kept his eyes on the map, studying it like there was still a battlefield left to maneuver. The others just stood there, silent, waiting for something they knew wasn't coming. The president's jaw tightened. He turned toward the Secretary of State, who hadn't spoken in hours. "Get me a direct line to our ambassador." The Secretary of State exhaled slowly. "The UN already met," he said. "Emergency session. They convened in Brussels under EU oversight." The president froze. "What?" "They voted unanimously." The Secretary of Defense finally looked up. "They're backing Russia and China." The words landed like a hammer to the chest. The president stared at them. The United Nations, the very institution the United States had built, had protected, had funded, had abandoned them in a single day. His breath hitched. He shook his head, forcing the thought away. It wasn't over. "The markets," he said. "We still control the dollar. We can force economic—" "No, sir." The Treasury Secretary didn't even let him finish. He had stopped looking at the screens hours ago. "The markets collapsed at 10 this morning," he said. "The dollar is worthless. We've been locked out of international exchanges." The president's chest tightened. There was still diplomacy. "There are embassies still open," he pushed. "Get the State Department running evacuation protocols. Our people need to get out." The CIA director exhaled through her nose. "Sir," she said, "China and Russia just declared our airspace a no-fly zone." He blinked. "We're quarantined." His stomach twisted. This wasn't just collapse. This was containment. He swallowed hard, gripping the table to steady himself. His breath came shallow and fast. This was not how it was supposed to happen. Not to him, not to America. His fingers curled against the steel surface, knuckles white. His vision tunneled onto the last active screen, a war-torn America, a dying republic. His lips curled in disgust. If he couldn't save it, then they wouldn't either. If they thought they could write the history books, they had another thing coming. His pulse slowed. His hands stopped shaking. A dark calm settled over him. He lifted his head, and for the first time all day, he knew exactly what to do. The president straightened, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the weight pressing down on him. They had abandoned him. The United Nations, Europe, the financial institutions. Even his own generals stood silent, watching him like a man already dead. They thought it was over. They thought America was gone. They thought he was beaten. But they had underestimated him. His grip tightened on the steel table. His breathing slowed. He had one move left, one final act. He reached for the nuclear football. "We launch," he said. No one spoke. He looked up, eyes burning. "Did you hear me?" The chairman of the Joint Chiefs stood still. The president's voice hardened. "We end this on our terms." The room was motionless. The Secretary of Defense ran a tired hand down his face. "Sir," he said, voice flat, exhausted. "To what end?" The president's face twisted. "To what end?" he repeated. His pulse pounded in his ears. "To win," he growled. "To make them pay." Still, no one moved. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs spoke softly. "Sir, there is no winning this." The words cut through him. The president's breath hitched. "We still have—" "There's nothing left," the Secretary of Defense interrupted. No allies, no economy, no command structure. The country is gone. The president staggered back from the table. His mind raced, grasping for anything, any leverage left. There has to be... There isn't! The words landed like a death sentence. His throat tightened. For the first time all day he had no answer, no threats, no plans, nothing. His vision blurred. His country was gone and history would never forgive him. Something deep in his chest fractured. His fingers curled around the launch key. If there was nothing left, then they wouldn't get to take it. If they thought they could erase America, then they would burn with it. The thought thrilled him. It was the first thing all day that felt right. His hand moved to the case, and then the Secret Service grabbed him. It happened fast. Hands on his arms, a sharp yank backward, his body twisting violently. No! They hauled him away from the table, from the football, from the last shred of control. He thrashed. He fought. "This is mutiny!" he bellowed. The officers stood still, watching. No one moved to stop it. "Cowards!" his voice cracked. "Traitors! Let me go!" The bunker door slammed shut, and for the first and last time in American history, a president was simply removed from power. The last message from the last U.S. command center was transmitted in a voice thick with exhaustion. "To any remaining U.S. military personnel, this is your final directive. Stand down. The war is over." The transmission cut out, and with it, the United States of America ceased to exist. By dawn on March 23, 2025, the negation was complete. There had been no great final battle, no last stand, no terms of surrender, only acceptance. The United Nations, convening in Brussels under emergency authority, formally recognized the transitional administrative authorities that now governed the former United States. China controlled the West. Russia controlled the East. Their forces moved through silent streets, patrolling what had once been the most powerful nation on Earth, though few remained to resist. America had not been defeated in war. It had simply ceased to function. And then came the quarantine. The meltdowns at Diablo Canyon, Braidwood, and Indian Point had already rendered vast sections of California, Illinois, and New York permanently uninhabitable. The radiation plume spread unchecked, carried by wind and rain, seeping into water tables and poisoning farmland. The federal agencies that might have contained the disaster no longer existed. There were no emergency responders, no coordinated evacuations. People fled blindly, unknowingly spreading contamination as they ran. Then the virus emerged. Bird flu had been simmering beneath the surface for months. A new H5N1 strain that had begun jumping to humans in isolated cases. The outbreak would have been containable under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. With no CDC, no functioning hospitals, no vaccine distribution, the disease spread unchecked. The former superpower, now a collapsed and irradiated wasteland, became the breeding ground for the next great pandemic. The world reacted swiftly. On March 29th, the final declaration came. The United States was no longer recognized as a sovereign entity. All remaining nuclear assets were placed under international control. The former US mainland was sealed. No flights left its airspace. No ships sailed from its coasts. No American citizen would ever again set foot on foreign soil. At first, the justification was security. Then it became survival. The fallen nation was not just politically dead. It was diseased, toxic, untouchable. And so the rest of the world moved on. The history books were rewritten. America had not been sabotaged. It had not been attacked. It had destroyed itself. A reckless empire that had played too many games, made too many enemies, and collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. That was the lesson they would teach. That was the warning future generations would heed. And in a single generation, the world would no longer remember the America that once was. Just that March 22nd was the day America destroyed itself.